Morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Cody Norrid, the Interim Executive Director at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, and this is Coffee and Something Stronger, a coffee chat interview style show where we talk to faith leaders, practitioners, and academics at the intersection of faith and theology and the social issues that are affecting us the most. And this morning, I'm able to bring on a good friend that I'm excited about, Avery Davis Lamb, who is currently the climate resilience intern at Creation Justice Ministries, but formerly was the federal policy associate with Interfaith Power and Light in DC, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. So Avery, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here.
So to start, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into doing the work of creation care and policy, and then ultimately you decided to go to seminary and you're continuing to do this work. So
yeah, thanks, Cody. It's great to be here with you. Great to be here with all of you over Facebook Live. I appreciate the opportunity. So I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, and I grew up in a Christian culture that didn't really talk much about creation care, didn't talk about the environment. And yet I feel like my family instilled some values about caring for the environment, and there was an innate connection to the more than spiritual world that I felt. And yet for so long I disconnected kind of the material experience of my that spirituality from the what I might call the dogmatics of my faith. There was a moment though during my years as an undergrad at Pepperdine where I was at a huge evangelical conference in Kansas City, and just had a moment of what I think of as my ecological conversion, which is a phrase that I'm stealing from Pope Francis that I think he'd be okay with me stealing. But there was just a moment that I realized that my Christian faith is not separate from this feeling of connection that I have to the natural world. And in fact, there's so much in my Christian faith that calls me to care for the people who are affected by the environment, environmental crisis, and to care for God's creation. And so up until that point, I hadn't really come across any Christian thinkers who were writing or thinking about this, but I went back hungry to just discover, of course, the plethora of Christians throughout history who have written and talked and, thought about the intersection of Christianity and the environmental crisis, Christianity and creation. And so just swallowed up as much of that as I could. Got involved in student organizing on campus, got involved in advocacy in a couple different ways, and just felt a distinct call towards the intersection of my Christian faith and healing of the world around me, both the human world and the more than human world. So following my time in California, I came to DC, did a brief stint with Sojourners, where I worked on climate justice campaigns and did some writing. And then, as Cody said, I jumped over and worked with Interfaith Power and Light, both at the federal level, connecting churches all across the United States with a voice on Capitol Hill to advocate for just and equitable climate solutions, as well as doing local organizing in the DC, Maryland, Virginia region around climate change and clean energy policy. And then after a few years there, felt like I needed to dig into theology, dig into both what I like to think of as both the skills and the affections that's required in this work. So I started a program at Duke last fall, and it's a program both at the Divinity School and the Nicholas School of the Environment, where I'm cultivating both a quantitative and a technical approach to solving environmental problems, as well as the really important spiritual and religious approach that we'll be talking about today.
Yeah.
This summer, we'll get a little bit more into what I'm working on this summer, but working with Creation Justice Ministries on resilience.
Great. Well, thank you again for being here. And I think you have a reading to offer to start us off.
I do. Yeah, so I'll give a little background on this reading. This is from an essay on the church forests of Ethiopia. It's an essay by Fred Bonson that was published in Emergence magazine probably 6 months or so ago. But Fred took a trip to Ethiopia to study these church forests, which around nearly every church in Ethiopia, there's a circle of forest that's preserved in the midst of widespread deforestation for the purposes of cattle ranching. And so the forests are hubs of biodiversity, hubs of resilience in a way. There's a person quoted in here, Dr. Almayehu, who's an Ethiopian ecologist who Fred met with and is studying these. These forests are not just good for people, Almayehu said. They are also the last shelter for wild animals. In our tradition, the church is like an ark, a shelter for every kind of creature and plant. If a wildcat or little kudu or vervet monkey leaves the church forest, immediately he will be killed. Here the animals are safe. In a previous conversation, Meg had described the church forests as a modern Noah's Ark. In the coming days, I would think back often to that image, reflecting on the ways in which these forests were living arks of biodiversity, tiny green vessels sailing over a barren sea of brown. In this time of rising waters and diminishing life, the church forests of Ethiopia are in many ways the perfect metaphor. As we sail into the Anthropocene bottleneck, a constriction of our own making, places like Ethiopia's church forests offer a vision of a future that we are making even now. We will need many more arcs like them, tens of thousands of arcs, cultural, biological, spiritual. Only then will we survive the storms that are surely coming, that have already arrived.
That's great. Thank you for bringing that. And what you said a little bit about the background of the passage, but why was that important for you to read?
Yeah, I think what's offered in this little snippet, and in the larger essay, if you have a chance to read it, I would highly suggest it, is a vision of the role that churches play, not only in providing spiritual support in the time of climate crisis, but of providing a physical solution and physical healing. And I think that's something that is often overlooked. I mean, it's impossible to separate the physical and the spiritual. It's naturally intertwined. But I think sometimes we can think about the church's role in the climate crisis as strictly spiritual, and that's not to diminish the importance of building rituals and helping people respond to the climate crisis. But churches also have lots of assets. They have land, they have buildings. In Ethiopia like this, they have expertise around biodiversity. And in our context, churches also have expertise. And so to think of the church as an ark into the climate crisis, similar to Noah's Ark, as Bahnsen says, a cultural, biological, a spiritual ark, I think is a really important shift when we start to think about the need for building resilience and the need not only for mitigating the future impacts of climate change, but also addressing the impacts of climate change that are here with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, before we get into it, I mean, just based on some of the stuff that you're saying, one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation today is because later in this week on Thursday, we're having the first Southeast Faith Leaders Network Climate Resilience Summit, which has been a bit of your masterpiece. And so I wonder if you'll let people know a bit about that. And everyone, I'm going to drop a link into the chat so you can find out more information and register if you'd like to join.
Great. Yeah, so like Cody said, this Thursday, August 6th, from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we're hosting the first ever Faith Communities and Climate Resilience Summit. And the purpose of this is to hear from a variety of frontline voices, experts, policymakers, different stakeholders who are being impacted by the climate crisis and who have solutions to share about how faith communities can be arcs of resilience to address the climate crisis that is here with us. So just a couple people we'll hear from. In Georgia, we'll be hearing from Rachel Thompson, who's the director of the Glen Environmental Coalition, who's going to share about resilience around Superfund sites, particularly along the coast and its intersection with environmental justice. We'll hear from Representative Donald McEachin, who is both the chair of the Environmental Justice Caucus in the House and part of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Representative Kathy Castor, who's the chair of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And I'll be sharing some kind of quantitative analysis and theological analysis of the role that churches can play.
Thank you so much. Well, everybody, please click on that link, register. It's on Thursday evening, and it's going to be a great time packed full of useful information. To what you were talking about earlier, oftentimes people do talk about solutions to climate change, or, how to draw down the most carbon in terms of climate mitigation. But simultaneously, we need to figure out ways to prevent more catastrophes in the future and the future warming of the planet. And yet we have to adapt to the disasters that are already here and that we know are coming. Even if we eliminated any more carbon from going into the atmosphere today, we know that that warming cycle continues and those disasters will continue to come. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that dichotomy.
Yeah. I think we've found ourselves trapped in a false dichotomy here in seeing climate mitigation and climate adaptation as a zero-sum game. And, that's not to diminish some of the reasons for that, which is that, climate adaptation can sometimes be used as a tool against taking meaningful climate mitigation action. But, like we're talking about here, the climate crisis has arrived. And that's become clear through the numerous climate disasters that have plagued the world just in the last couple of years, ranging from Hurricane Harvey and other intense hurricanes in the east and the southeast, wildfires in the west, severe flooding in Southeastern Asia, record heat waves throughout Europe. All of these are symptoms of the climate crisis that is already here. And if we're going to live into our role as being stewards of our neighbors, caring for our neighbors, caring for God's creation, then we really have no choice but to have a focus on climate adaptation. Now, again, climate adaptation and mitigation are not a zero-sum game, and we have to seek both. One of the things that I'll share at the summit on Thursday is just some maps that show the difference between 3 feet of sea level rise and 8 feet of sea level rise. And that's essentially the difference that we're looking at in the year 2100, is depending on the trajectory of greenhouse gases, and of course a lot of mystery about the climate system that we don't know, we could end up with anywhere between 3 and 8 feet of sea level rise. And that difference is huge. That's, the difference between being able to adapt and save communities and preserve communities, help environmental justice communities, transition into a sustainable way of living, or, widespread devastation, both here in the United States and around the world. So climate mitigation itself is an act of adaptation, but it's an act of adaptation, thinking forward 50 to 80 years. Bottom line here is that we have to have both. And if we care for our neighbors, then we need to invest resources both in building resilience and adapting right now, and in ensuring that the climate crisis is as limited as possible.
Yeah. Well, I know you've been doing a lot with thinking about those questions and that dichotomy in relation to coastal communities, especially.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I know this will be some of the summit, but what are some practical things that congregations should be doing to understand these challenges, both to prepare for what's coming and do their part to prevent further climate change, whether on the coast or whether they're inland?
Yeah. So I'm going to point everyone to a website, and Cody, maybe you can drop this in the chat.
Sure.
But at creationjustice.org/resilience, we've just launched a number of resources to help churches think about resilience in their own context. The first of which is an interactive map that you can look at on there that has several thousand congregations that mapped on top of projections of sea level rise and storm surge for the next century. So you can actually go on there and see how physically the climate crisis will be impacting communities of faith. And you can search your own community in there. And that doesn't provide any solutions, but what it does is it shows us the reality of what's coming. And in order to have solutions, we have to be able to look face to face with the reality of what we're going to be dealing with and, grieve the losses that are going to happen, and then move towards action. So that's one of the resources. The other is a 6-part resilience study guide entitled Faithful Resilience that is intended to be used in a congregation for taking on resilience. It's adaptable. It can either be used as a 6-part Bible study. There's theological underpinning and scriptural grounding in each of those weeks around 6 different themes. Or it could be used as a sermon guide. If you want to do a sermon series on resilience, then you can do the same. And I'll just give a kind of a couple of themes from that to share with you all right now. It's organized really around starting with the assets that are available in your church. And this is kind of central to resilience is every community has different assets. And that means resilience is going to look different in every community. So where you want to start is you want to think about, okay, what assets does my church have in order to build resilience? If you have land, then maybe it's time to think about how you can utilize that land to, if you're along the coast, absorb more water, pulling out lawn and putting in rain gardens or native vegetation, or perhaps building gardens to provide food security and food resilience for the community. If you have a large building that is only used a couple days a week, think about how can you change the use of that building so that you're absorbing the people who might be displaced from climate disasters, especially as we're going into hurricane season, a season that's predicted to be an above average hurricane season by NOAA. How can you prepare your physical space, particularly in the midst of COVID, to absorb people who are going to be displaced and who won't have anywhere to go? And then finally, maybe you have social capital, maybe you have community assets, maybe you're a trusted voice in the community. So how do you use that role to talk about the disasters that are coming, both sea level rise and intensifying hurricanes? How do you use that to talk about, the possibility of retreat, of moving away from the coast if that's what becomes necessary? We need trusted messengers to talk about these things in a way that is gentle and community oriented, because they're hard topics to talk about. And the church has some of the best tools to be able to do that. So those are just 3 of the 6 themes in that study guide. But again, the most important piece here is to start with the assets that are available at your church and work from there.
Yeah, it is sort of about being creative with your asset mapping, because you can, congregations by and large want to figure out ways to serve their communities and their neighbors. And what you can do is to think creatively about, how you can use your land, how can you use your building, what can you prepare for? Can you also do solar so that when the grid is down, that you can actually serve as this hub to be able to help people, have you prepared in advance for those things? And I think it's a great thing for congregations to think about, a little bit of foresight, especially those on the coast, but even those inland who can accept those people fleeing from the coast in times of disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think an important piece here too is our churches are already doing a lot of the work of resilience. Building community is resilience. The important piece is to, shift that continual work of resilience towards kind of more of a preparedness, and doing it with an eye towards the disasters that are already happening and that are coming, just to be able to prepare more effectively.
So we've talked a little bit about what congregations can do practically. And of course, again, I'll encourage everyone to attend the summit and to hear more about some of that stuff. But you are a policy expert also. And I wonder if you could talk about kind of on the local level as you've been talking to these communities and also on the federal level, what solutions do you see on the horizon that individuals and congregations should be pushing for? And what solutions or creativity do you think is lacking that we should be pushing for?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with a big shift in framework that we need when it comes to policy solutions around resilience. And that is a shift from a policy focus on recovery to a policy focus on preparedness and resilience. So many resources from the federal level to the local level, and even from the local level to the NGO level, are focused on disaster recovery. And of course, that makes sense because that's the paradigm that has served our communities for the last century. Is disasters are spaced enough apart, they're essentially few and far between, that we can invest in recovery and expect with some certainty that another disaster is not going to hit that community for a couple more decades. But of course, as we've talked about, the climate crisis shatters that paradigm. And what we're seeing now in communities across the East Coast, throughout the Southeast, in the West, around the world, is disaster after disaster after disaster. Multiple years of 100-year, 500-year flooding happening concurrently. And what that means is organizations and agencies get stuck in a cycle of disaster recovery where they're never able to fully recover from a disaster before they start responding to the other one. And what's happening here is all of the resources are being invested in recovery and perpetuating that cycle instead of being invested in resilience in order to prepare beforehand. So that's what we need. Essentially, any agency that ends in EMA, emergency management agency, so that's FEMA at federal, or here in North Carolina, the North Carolina EMA or Georgia EMA. Any organization that ends with EMA needs to start shifting its focus and its resources from to resilience. And those resources need to be invested on a community level instead of on kind of a state or a federal level, because these community organizations are the ones who are already building resilience, and all recovery and resilience is local. And so they know what is needed at a local level. And so that needs to be invested. So that's number one, policy that can be advocated for is shifting resources from recovery to resilience. The second one that we need is we need a large-scale buyout program, both at the federal and the state level. And we need to provide resources for homeowners, particularly low-income homeowners and business owners who recognize what's coming and want to get out. We need to provide resources for them to be bought out by the federal and state government so that they can prepare, so that they have the resources to move wherever they need to go. And that both provides an incentive for communities who really do need to move away from the coast, who might be chronically flooded or be part of repeated flooding areas in the coast, to have the resources and the incentive to move their community away. And second, it provides land for state and federal agencies to invest in natural infrastructure that is going to buffer us from some of the worst storms that are coming. Amazingly, so many pieces of God's creation are already able to protect us from intense hurricanes. They can't do everything, but wetlands and salt marshes and mangrove swamps, depending on where you are along the Southeast, can do wonders in mitigating storm surge and mitigating hurricane intensity. But what we need to have the land to restore those. So that's the second piece, is advocating for a large-scale buyout program on both the federal and the state level. And then the third piece is the National Flood Insurance Program just needs to be deeply rehauled. Um, the National Flood Insurance Program is, yeah, I think it's 50 or 60 years old by now, and it has not adapted to the climate crisis. And so, what it is, it's deeply insolvent, it is deeply in debt, and it subsidizes insurance premiums in a way that doesn't reflect the risk of living in high flood areas. So a couple ways that this could be resolved is to enroll everyone in the National Flood Insurance Program, whether you're living in the Rocky Mountains or whether you're on the Inner Banks of North Carolina, and have premiums reflected with flood risk. What that does is it would actually lower premiums for those who are along the coast, which is a big problem for a lot of low-income communities. And it broadens the risk pool so that whenever there are insurance payouts through the National Flood Insurance Program, it doesn't immediately go into debt. So again, the third one is a rehaul of the National Flood Insurance Program in a way that is going to lift up low-income communities instead of continue to bury them under premium costs.
Yeah, you've lifted up a couple of solutions, all of which no doubt take a lot of time, a lot of pressure, a lot of attention to ensure that any kind of those solutions might actually make it into some systemic policy change.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were talking earlier about things that faith communities can do on the ground, as a person who's been working with faith communities on a variety of policy levels, I wonder if you could say a word about why you think it is kind of the religious duty of people to get engaged in policy work and systemic change.
Yeah, yeah, this is so important. This is a shift in thinking about policy, I think, is really needed in our faith communities. The way I think about it is that policy and politics is our way of organizing our collective life together. And that by engaging in systemic change through policy, we are able to better care for our neighbor. Direct service is great, direct service is amazing and so important. And at the end of the day, systemic issues are always going to overshadow any sort of changes that can occur at a direct service level. And so to fully and completely love our neighbor, we need to be involved in the political process of changing some of these systemic injustices that occur throughout our government, both from the federal level to the state level. And I think there's a real biblical basis for this too. We read in the writing of Paul that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but our struggle is against the powers and principalities of the world. And of course, there he was talking about the Roman Empire. I think there are lots of powers and principalities that are encoded in law in our country that are perpetuating systemic injustice, environmental injustice, systemic racism. And if our struggle is against powers and principalities, then we better start organizing to change those laws. And we better start advocating with our lawmakers to encode laws that uplift rather than oppress our neighbors.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really important. I want to shift us a bit to maybe a bit of social policy, but also a bit of theology, and talk about something that we've talked on the show a lot with different speakers is the idea that environmental work. So first of all, there can't be any climate justice without environmental justice, and that this sort of sense of environmental work is best done when it is place-based, it is in your community, it is where you live, it's connected to your story, you're kind of building up this relationship with creation, and then by doing so, you're deepening relationships with your neighbor. And yet, we've talked a little bit about places that will become unlivable, that will be flooded or will have wildfires. And so we talked a little bit about this, but how can we talk about the need for retreat or a transition from these places in a way that doesn't replicate sort of displacement culture or acts of gentrification or pushing people out in some kind of way that is glorified by capitalism and reminiscent of colonialism?
Mm. Yeah, this is a huge question. And I think this question is really going to be central to the way we think about retreat and resilience in the next 10 to 20 years as it becomes more and more clear that there are communities both along the coast and in other areas of the country that will need to be moved. Um, I'll go ahead and say I don't have a great answer to this, uh, but I think it's a question that has to be struggled with and has to be worked through. And we may never have a comfortable answer because one reality of the climate crisis is that it brings up a lot of questions for which we don't have answers. So I have a couple of frameworks that I use to think about this question that I'll go ahead and share. The first is that connection to place is so intimately connected with health. And that's several dimensions of health. Psychological health and mental health. There's numerous studies that show that when we have a strong community, when we have a sense of belonging, then our mental health is so much better. And I think that's one of the symptoms of the culture of displacement that we see in the 21st century, particularly among millennials and some Gen Z, is that displacement and cosmopolitanism has been glorified. The result is that people don't have a community and don't have a connection to place, and thus their mental health is severely impacted. Churches can play a really important role in countering that trend. Of course, there's physical health that's related to that and spiritual health. But what churches do is they provide grounding in a community. They provide grounding that is connected to a place. And of course, I know we've all heard the adage, the church is not a building, but a community. And that rings true now during Zoom, time of Zoom church. But I think experiences that I'm having right now, at least, is that I miss the brick and mortar experience of church in the midst of being displaced. And I miss, having a place to go that is a grounding of community. So what we have here are churches that are providing a counter against the displacement culture. And yet, as I mentioned before, churches can also be hubs of beginning a conversation around retreat from places that will be uninhabitable. And the second framework that I'll share that I think is helpful in talking about this is thinking about our communities as being porous. That's both porous to the our human neighbors locally and around the world who are going to be displaced from climate change and who will be coming into our communities. We need to be porous with open arms and open doors, inviting them from whatever area or culture they're coming from, making them feel at home because they will be experiencing severe displacement. So that's kind of hospitality as an act of being porous. Another one is being porous to non-human creation. And this is so important in resilience. The Army Corps of Engineers, their paradigm for the last 150 years has been to hard armor infrastructure against God's creation, against water. And what has resulted is just much more devastation, much more flooding. There's all kinds of hydrological studies that show that the more permeable pavement, the more hard armoring you have, the more intense disasters are going to be. And it makes sense because water moves faster over concrete than it moves through soil. And so, again, as the climate crisis is accelerating the migration of God's non-human creation, as the climate crisis is accelerating the extinction of God's non-human creation, and as we can see that God's non-human creation has a huge role to play in building resilience against the storms of the climate crisis, then let's start to look at our physical land as an opportunity to be porous and to absorb the water, to absorb the non-human creatures who are going to be displaced. And
Yeah.
if needed, to shift a community from a space that is going to be flooded because of climate change to somewhere else in a watershed that won't be. And that role as a shepherd, or that role of an ark, is central.
Yeah, I like that. The kind of example that you've teased out about the ark, sort of the congregations being transitioning points for communities. We are getting towards the end of our time, but I want to talk about, a lot of what you have mentioned relies on creativity. And previously in other interviews, we've kind of talked about that creativity is kind of it is the resource that can help when you are standing up against empire. It is the resource that can help in protest. It is the resource that can help against injustice and, of course, against climate change, because it requires us to push beyond what we think we can do or what we know how to do in the ways we know how to do it now. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about ritual making and creativity in the midst of climate change, but also other injustices, such as police brutality or pandemics, and how ritual making can overlay with that and help communities.
Yeah. Oh, this is so important. One of the symptoms that I've experienced in the climate crisis is dislocation. And that's not only dislocation in the sense of displacement physically that we were talking about before, but just not being able to understand what's happening. I think that's true of COVID right now too, is it's just so hard to make meaning of everything that is occurring in this world. And essentially that's what our rituals do, is they lead us in a community process of being able to make meaning of really hard and really important creaturely experiences. And that's not to say, what I don't want to say is rituals as helping us see that everything happens for a reason, because that's not true at all. And in fact, I think it's the opposite, that rituals help us make meaning in the midst of things that happen for no reason at all. Robin Wall Kimmerer, in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, has a really amazing kind of reflection on ceremonies in her indigenous culture. And she says that ceremonies in our tradition are ways of, it's how we remember to remember. And I think there is kind of a remembering that needs to happen here, a remembering that we've gone through crises before, and that we're going through crises now. And also that what we're addressing is new, and we have to create new rituals that both draw on our tradition, but innovate and improvise in ways that address the particularities of the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we are getting close to closing out, and Avery, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning. I'll ask you the same question that ends all of our interviews right now, which is, what are you missing the most in the COVID-19 world, and what gives you hope to keep doing the work that you're doing?
Like I mentioned before, I'm missing in-person connection and community. I'm missing passing the peace in church. I'm missing taking communion from my community members, kind of these material expressions of faith that just can't be translated over the computer. What gives me hope are, on the flip side of that, the ways that hospitality is being expressed in this time. I'm seeing amazing expressions of hospitality in the midst of this crisis. And if our community networks can extend that to the climate crisis and to crises of systemic racism and systemic injustice, then it gives me hope that we can actually make some change.
That's great. I'm going to close us out with a reading from Barbara Brown Taylor's Altar in the World that I think is poignant, giving the talks about the coast. She says, after the crashing of the waves, the sanctuary of the still pool hit me with the sound of sheer silence. The calm water lay so green and cool before me that it calmed me too. Nothing stirred the face of the water save the breeze coming off the ocean, which caused it to wrinkle from time to time. Walking around the pool, I came to 3 stones set upright near the edge where the water was deepest. All 3 were shaped like fat baguettes, with the tallest one in the middle. The other 2 were set snug up against it, the same gray color as humpbacked whales. All together, they announced that something significant had happened in that place. I was not the first person to be affected by it. Whoever had come before me had set up an altar, and though I might never know what that person had encountered there, I knew the name of the place, Bethel, House of God. Thank you all so much for being with us this morning, and you will see us here at the same time, same place. Next week, we'll be talking with Alice Keyes from 100 Miles, more on coastal resilience and coastal communities here in Georgia.